It was the kind of morning Oxford occasionally affords her more reluctant children. Pale skies hung with damp, a suggestion of mist still clinging about the river, and bells striking the hour with an authority entirely out of step with the languor of those who heard them. I had no reason to be walking past Magdalen just then, but habit, like an old tune, had brought me there. The bell tolled from the tower, deep and certain, and in that sound lay some faint premonition I could not quite name. One does not expect an epiphany on the high. More often it comes in the margins of half a line in a sermon, never meant for you, the awkward pause before a friend tells you something they never intended to share. The bell that morning was neither, yet it stayed with me. By the time I reached the bridge, I had already begun to suspect it was less the call of the college and more the reminder of an absence. A man missing is louder than the men who remain. Lewis had mentioned, in his careful way, a disappearance, a junior fellow not long settled into his post. There had been no panic in his voice, but the worry was there, hidden under his usual bluntness. He had said only, "They think he's gone off, sir." And I had wondered why a fellow of Magdalen would go off without a word, leaving papers on his desk and a bed turned back, as though for a brief rest. Such small gestures are more eloquent than any note. I stopped at the porter's lodge, where the scent of polish and stale tobacco was thick in the air. The porter, a man of sufficient years to find nothing remarkable in sudden absences, told me that the fellow had been seen on the previous evening passing under the cloisters with a book tucked under his arm. Nothing more. I asked whether the book had been returned, though why the question came I could not say. He looked at me blankly, as if I had spoken in some foreign tongue. Inside the quadrangle, the stones were wet and luminous, reflecting the faintest light. A student hurried past, head down, shoes clattering on the ancient flags. I thought of how often this college had concealed both genius and ruin beneath its polite surfaces. Some men vanish into libraries, others into rivers. One hardly knows which is more permanent. Lewis joined me after some delay, his raincoat too large for him and his shoes squeaking with each step. He said the missing fellow had left his bicycle untouched in the rack by the porter's lodge. A curious thing. In Oxford one leaves many things unattended, but never the means of going home. I remarked that a bicycle is more honest than a diary. It will tell you whether a man truly intended not to return. Lewis gave me that puzzled look of his, which I have long cherished. In the fellow's rooms I noted a crossword begun but unfinished. Several clues filled, none especially difficult, save for a corner left blank. I bent closer, reading the letters already inscribed. A pattern emerged, faint but insistent. 3 answers, each alluding to absence. Gone, lost, void. The sort of coincidence one prefers not to believe in. And yet there it was, staring up from the newsprint with a composure bordering on insolence. The rain began again, light but steady, tapping at the window like a student uncertain whether to knock. I stood in that narrow room, aware of dust, of ink, of a half-drunk cup of tea with the faint scum of milk along its rim. Such ordinary detritus, yet they form the true measure of a man's leaving. I said to Lewis he did not plan to vanish. The room contradicts the act. And Lewis, ever practical, replied that people contradict themselves all the time. Perhaps they do, but as we left I could not forget the bell. It sounded less like a summons than a lament, and in its echo I thought I heard the faint beginning of a truth. The Ashmolean has never been a place for the faint-hearted. Too much stone, too much silence, too much of the past staring back in fragments and shadows. Yet that morning I found myself there, the marble steps slick with drizzle, the echo of the bell at Magdalen still disturbing the quieter chambers of my thoughts. Antiquities have a way of mocking the present, and it was among such relics that death had chosen to intrude. They told me it was a scholar, a man devoted to the dust of forgotten dynasties, who had been discovered lifeless in one of the smaller galleries. He had been cataloguing Mesopotamian shards, his notes scattered like the remnants of a language no longer spoken. There was nothing spectacular about his passing, no blood, no violence, only the sudden stillness of a body slumped over a desk as though overcome by the weight of history. And yet even stillness can be suspicious when it falls too neatly into place. The attendant who had found him spoke with an odd mixture of reverence and irritation, as if the inconvenience of death had unsettled the day's routine more than the fact of it. He had noticed, he said, that the man's spectacles had slipped to the floor, one lens cracked against the flagstones, a detail so small, and yet it seemed curiously deliberate. People rarely die tidily. Glasses remain perched, books lie open, pens trail across unfinished lines. Here the pen was capped, the book closed, the desk strangely orderly, as though death had been invited rather than endured. Lewis looked at me with that steady patience of his and asked whether I thought it was suicide. I could not answer him. The temptation to arrange one's own departure with scholarly neatness is not unknown. But a man who takes such care in his leaving usually provides some signal of intent. Here there was nothing, no note, no rearrangement of affairs, only silence and the faint smell of dust and polish. I found myself staring at the catalogue sheet upon which he had last written. The handwriting was small, precise, almost too precise, the kind that betrays a man's anxieties more than his discipline. He had left off an entry describing a fragment of cuneiform tablet. The translation was partial, a single word underlined twice. Exile. Beneath it, the ink had blotted faintly as though the pen had lingered there a moment too long. It may have been nothing. Yet I could not escape the feeling that the word was more personal than philological. The gallery was cold, the kind of cold that seems indifferent to heating, born of stone and age. I touched the glass case near the desk and found it faintly smudged with fingerprints. Nothing unusual, perhaps, but one smudge lay at an angle inconsistent with the others, as if someone had rested a hand there in quiet desperation. The faintest mark of human presence in a place otherwise devoted to the absence of it. Lewis remarked that the scholar had few acquaintances, fewer friends. His life had been books, fragments, the reconstruction of lost empires. Some men vanish into such pursuits long before their bodies give out. But I said to him that solitude is not the same as exile. Exile requires a place from which to be banished. Perhaps the scholar had such a place once, though no one now remembered it. We left the gallery slowly, the sound of our steps loud against the stone. I thought again of the spectacles lying fractured upon the floor, and of the word underlined twice. Exile. There are words that speak to us long after their authors have fallen silent. Words that resist translation, remaining stubbornly personal, like secrets left unspoken in the margins of a life. And as I walked back into the Oxford rain, I found myself wondering whether the dead man had intended me, a stranger, to notice. I have always thought that the Ashmole collection, for all its grandeur, belonged less to Oxford than to the long-dead gentleman who assembled it. A museum is not merely a house for objects, but a mausoleum for intentions, each label a brief epitaph. It was there, in the back offices smelling of dust and varnish, that I first met the keeper. He was a man of uncertain years, the sort whose features suggested neither age nor youth, but a kind of weary permanence. His voice was soft, with the curious cadence of one who has spoken too often to empty rooms. He did not ask why I had come. Instead, he began talking about catalogues, inventories, and the endless struggle to coax order from the chaos of centuries. Only later did he mention the scholar who had died among his antiquities, as though the death were but another misplaced item requiring eventual notation. Lewis sat quietly beside me, taking in the room's chaos with a patience I lacked. Shelves groaned beneath files, drawers gaped with mislabeled folders, the floor bore the scar of some long-forgotten leak. Yet amid the disorder there was a strange precision. On the keeper's desk lay a single sheet of paper, folded once, precisely, the edges aligned. He did not touch it while we were there, though I noticed his gaze wander to it more than once. A man's eyes often reveal what his words seek to hide. He asked me whether I believed the scholar's death had been sudden. I told him suddenness is rarely the problem, it is preparation that concerns me. The keeper smiled faintly, as though amused at my choice of words. He said the scholar had been engaged in translating a fragment about exile, or banishment. He used the word reluctantly, like a man recalling a dream too vivid for comfort. Exile is a curious theme in Oxford, I thought. Most of us never truly leave. We merely shift our hauntings to different quadrangles. Lewis, with his straightforward courtesy, asked about visitors. The keeper shook his head. Few came here, he said, save for the most dedicated of researchers. He seemed almost proud of the isolation. Yet I could not help noticing a cup on the side table, not his own. 2 rings of faint stain on the wood. Someone else had been there recently, someone whose presence he had chosen not to mention. Silence, after all, is as deliberate as speech. I asked him about the spectacles, whether he had noticed their position. He claimed ignorance, though he spoke too quickly, as if rehearsed. There are small lies in every investigation, but it is the hurried ones that betray unease. I thought then of the crossword in the dead man's rooms, the answers converging on absence. Was the keeper aware of it? Had he read the paper, borrowed it, folded it neatly before our arrival? The possibility hung in the air like the dust that shimmered in the thin light from the window. We left after some time, the keeper still speaking softly, his words dissolving into the silence of the corridor. As we walked back through the gallery, Lewis remarked that the man seemed harmless enough. Harmless, perhaps, but not guileless. A custodian is defined by what he conceals as much as by what he preserves. I said only that the folded sheet on the desk troubled me more than the disorder that surrounded it. For disorder is natural, neatness is almost always contrived. That evening, over a glass of whisky, I found myself turning the word exile over in my mind. The keeper had spoken it with reluctance, the scholar had underlined it twice, and the bell at Magdalen had tolled with a melancholy that seemed to echo the same theme. Coincidences, perhaps, but Oxford has a way of binding its coincidences until they resemble design, and I, against my better judgment, had begun to sense that design forming. There are days when Oxford seems composed entirely of puzzles. Arched windows glimpsed through drizzle, Latin inscriptions no one translates anymore, conversations broken off just when they begin to matter. And there are, too, the literal puzzles folded into the morning papers, waiting to be filled by men who need something more orderly than life itself. It was to one such crossword that I returned late that evening in the solitude of my rooms. The sheet had been torn, the top corner missing. Yet enough remained. 3 answers already inked, gone, void, lost. I traced the letters with a finger, the way one might read a braille of sorrow. The scholar had left this behind, not consciously perhaps, but in the manner of a man whose thoughts seep outward against his will. Was it nothing more than coincidence? Lewis would have said so with his stubborn practicality. But I had never been able to trust coincidence. It smacks too much of intent. Earlier, in the porter's lodge, I had overheard a remark from a young student. He had said the fellow often solved his crossword in the bar after hall, scribbling with a kind of fierce intensity, as though the black and white squares contained some secret code. I thought then of the neat fold on the keeper's desk, the way his eyes had strayed toward it. A crossword folded is an unfinished confession. People rarely fold away what they are eager to complete. I poured a measure of whiskey, the glass cool against my palm, and studied the half-empty grid. One clue in particular had been left untouched. 4 letters to be without a place. An easy word, surely, for a man immersed in ancient languages. Yet he had left it blank, resisting its obvious solution. Home, or perhaps root. But there is another word one I could not dismiss as null. It carries the quiet devastation of erasure. To be without place is not merely to be lost, it is to be made void. Lewis had earlier insisted that the missing bicycle suggested permanence to a man leaving without intention of return. I told him he was half right. The bicycle does speak, but so does the crossword. The bicycle says he is gone. The crossword says he was never here. 2 different messages, both demanding to be believed. The rain thickened outside, rattling against the window. In that sound I heard again the keeper's careful diction, his reluctance over the word exile. Was the crossword his too? Had he, not the scholar, folded it neatly and left it where it might be found? It would not be the first time a man of learning disguised his voice by borrowing another's handwriting. Knowledge and deceit often share the same shelf. I leaned back, staring at the paper until the letters blurred. One small deduction crept forward, tentative yet insistent. The scholar's answers were too consistent, too thematically linked. Crosswords, unless constructed by mischief-makers, rarely align themselves around a single obsession. 3 words of absence, each placed with precision, and then the unfilled clue, the withheld word. Perhaps the crossword had been less a pastime than a message. Not a message to himself, but to whomever would later find it. I told Lewis the next day that people confess in the strangest ways. He looked at me, half smiling, and asked if I was accusing the crossword of murder. I said nothing. He would not have understood that silence is sometimes louder than confession. We walked on in silence, our shoes darkened by wet stone, and I thought again of the folded sheet on the keeper's desk and the way his eyes had betrayed him. It is not the answers that matter, but the refusal to write one in. I have never trusted silence in museums. It is not silence at all, but the accumulated murmur of centuries pressed down into stone and glass until it hums at the edges of one's hearing. It was in such silence that I first noticed the woman in the gallery standing so still that at first I mistook her for part of the collection itself. She was gazing not at the great Assyrian reliefs that lined the walls, but at a smaller case where a clay tablet sat fractured and incomplete. She seemed to be listening to it, as if it alone might speak. Lewis and I had returned to the Ashmolean under pretext of routine, though routine rarely compelled me. What drew me was the folded crossword, the word exile, the keeper's unwillingness to look me in the eye. Yet it was the woman who became the true puzzle. She had the air of someone who belonged, and yet did not. Her coat was a little too elegant for a research student, her shoes too discreetly expensive. She nodded politely as we passed, though her eyes did not leave the tablet. Eyes that carried a suggestion of sorrow, not quite rehearsed. Lewis muttered, "She seems familiar." I wondered whether he was right, whether she had been seen before in some other corner of Oxford, in a hall at evensong, in the hush of the Bodleians' upper reading room. Oxford is a small city, yet vast in its echoes. One can lose a face there only to have it return in some unexpected place like a refrain. I approached her softly. She smiled without surprise, as though she had anticipated the interruption. I asked what interested her in the fragment. She said only that exile leaves a mark deeper than any chisel. The words were strange, almost borrowed, and I felt them lodge somewhere I could not name. She turned away then as if to dismiss herself, but I noticed her fingers brush the glass of the case, lightly, tenderly. Not the idle touch of curiosity, but of recognition. Later in the cafe, Lewis suggested she was a widow. He had caught the plain gold band on her finger, the way she twisted it absent-mindedly. He said widows often haunt such places. I asked whether he thought grief could be assuaged by Mesopotamian clay. He shrugged. People grieve where they can. I could not disagree. One detail, however, refused to leave me. The keeper had denied visitors, insisting few came to his secluded rooms. Yet the rings on the side table had already told me otherwise, and here was a woman whose eyes did not wander to the grand displays, but lingered on the very fragment that the scholar had been translating when he died. Coincidence, Lewis would have said again, but I have never liked that word. That evening, alone, I reconstructed her gesture in my mind. The way she touched the glass, not to steady herself, but to acknowledge it, like one might greet an old friend. I recalled, too, her words of exile, leave a mark. Marks are precisely what fragments preserve, and then, in a corner of memory, a small deduction flickered into light the fingerprints I had seen on the case during my earlier visit, one at an angle unlike the rest. A woman's hand, perhaps. Her hand. It was nothing definite, yet it settled into my thoughts like an unwelcome lodger. I never learned her name that day. She vanished as quietly as she had appeared, slipping down the stone stairs before I could follow. The gallery returned to its heavy silence, the kind that seems to settle not on objects, but on the people who study them. Yet her presence lingered, and I carried it with me through the rain-washed streets of Oxford, uncertain whether she was a witness, mourner, or something else altogether. There are few sounds more desolate than the faint tear of paper. A whisper, a rift, the quiet undoing of what was once whole. That night, seated at my desk with the crossword still before me, I realized one page had gone missing from the scholar's notebook. Not mislaid, not overlooked, but deliberately torn. The binding bore its absence with all the eloquence of a scar. Lewis had brought the notebook earlier in the day, his manner brisk, practical, as though it were just another item of evidence to be checked off a list. He said it was filled with transliterations, lexical notes, citations in margins so cramped they might have required a magnifying glass. He had not noticed the absence, but I had. A gap where there should have been continuity, a silence where a voice ought to have carried on. I asked him whether the keeper had seen the notebook. Lewis thought not. Yet I found myself remembering the folded sheet upon the keeper's desk, and the unease in his eyes when I had mentioned suddenness. I studied the ragged edge of the missing page as one might study a wound. There is intent in a tear. A careless hand leaves frayed corners. This one was clean, certainly. A single motion, confident. Someone had taken precisely what they required, leaving the rest intact, which is often the greater cruelty, not to destroy, but to remove only what matters most. The room was dim, the lamp casting uneven light across the paper. I turned each page slowly, noting the meticulous handwriting. He had been a man of care, of method. No crossings out, no blots. His precision left little room for accident, and so the missing page stood out more starkly. It was the one imperfection in a life that, at least in ink, had sought to avoid them. A line caught my attention. In the margin of one earlier page he had scribbled a single English phrase, incongruous among the cuneiform notations. "Remember the bell." The words startled me with their simplicity. They returned me at once to that morning outside Magdalen, the tolling that had stirred something nameless within me. Was it coincidence that both scholar and detective had fixed upon the same sound? Or had he, too, heard in the bell not merely a marking of the hour, but a summons, a lament? Lewis, when I mentioned it, seemed unimpressed. He said, "Bells toll every day, and men hear in them only what they bring with them. Perhaps. Yet why would a scholar of the ancient Near East trouble to record such a phrase in his working notebook, unless it meant something beyond itself? Perhaps the torn page had carried its explanation. Perhaps someone had wished it was gone. I thought again of the woman in the gallery, her fingertips grazing the glass, her voice weighted with that peculiar word, exile. She had looked at the fragment as though it belonged to her, as though it contained something more personal than history. Did the missing page speak of her? Had the scholar written her name in the margin, drawn some connection too dangerous to survive intact? The possibility was neither provable nor deniable. It sat in my mind unquiet. I closed the notebook gently, as if by sparing its spine I might conjure back what was lost. Outside, rain pressed against the window, steady, patient, indifferent. Oxford in the rain is never entirely silent. The stones seem to breathe beneath it, each droplet an echo of countless others across centuries. I lifted my glass, finished the last of the whiskey, and let the quiet swallow me whole. A page torn, a word underlined, a bell that refused to stop ringing. These were my companions that night, and they told me nothing, except that absence itself was beginning to speak. The senior common room is never entirely dark, even when the lamps are dimmed and the curtains half drawn against the night. There remains the glow of polished wood, the faint gleam of decanters, the muted flicker of portraits whose subjects seem to have no wish to sleep. I entered with Lewis at my side, the hush broken only by the slow settling of chairs and the whisper of someone turning pages by the fire. It was not a place for inquiry, yet it was there that the case began to take on its darker outlines. The master greeted us without warmth, though without hostility either. His voice was courteous, the kind of voice that could preside over dinner speeches and disciplinary hearings with equal detachment. He asked whether our presence was strictly necessary. I told him necessity is never strictly anything. It is often nothing more than curiosity dressed as duty. He offered a thin smile and gestured to us to sit. A servant in black waistcoat moved quietly about with the sherry, his footsteps muffled by a carpet older than Lewis and I combined. There were 3 dons in attendance besides the master, their faces lit unevenly by firelight. One of them, a historian, spoke of the dead scholar with measured indifference. He was promising, he said, but promise is a fragile currency in Oxford. Another, a philosopher, remarked that men who live among fragments are themselves often fractured. Only the third, a literary man with reddened eyes, seemed to struggle with the memory. He looked at me with something like appeal, though whether for understanding or absolution, I could not tell. As they spoke, I noticed the table nearest the window. A chessboard lay upon it, half played. Black moved, though no one seemed in a hurry to continue. The knight was poised awkwardly as though suspended in thought. I leaned closer, tracing the line of play, and saw at once that White's position was lost. A subtle trap had already closed around the king, though the players had left it unresolved. It struck me then that unfinished games, like torn pages and folded puzzles, tell more than the ones completed. Someone had walked away rather than accept defeat. I asked quietly, who had been playing. The historian muttered that it had been the keeper visiting for port one evening. He did not return to finish. Lewis caught my eye, his brow furrowing. He would not have noticed the resignation implicit in that board, the small refusal to see through what one has already lost. But I had. And it whispered something to me of the keeper's state of mind, or perhaps of his deceptions. The conversation turned, as it inevitably must, to the woman. The philosopher recalled seeing her once in the gallery, her presence unsettling for reasons he could not define. He thought she might have been foreign, though he admitted he was poor at placing accents. The literary man said nothing, only stared into his glass with an expression so sorrowful I almost envied him its honesty. The master, meanwhile, declared firmly that no record of her existed in the college books. Records, however, are less reliable than shadows. When at last we left, Lewis remarked that we had learned little. I told him that little is often enough. The chessboard, the woman unnamed, the Don's evasions, each was a fragment, waiting to be fitted. He asked what the fragments might form. I said only that Oxford itself was the puzzle, and the solution, if there was one, would be as ambiguous as the city's silence. Outside, the quad lay drenched in rain, lamps throwing pale circles on the stones. Behind us, the senior common room settled back into its shadows, but I could not shake the image of the chessboard left unfinished, its unplayed move hanging in the air like a question no one dared answer. Wine has a way of revealing things that words alone cannot. In Oxford, it is rarely the lecture hall or the library that loosens tongues, but the bottle passed between dons in the privacy of their own rooms. That evening, I sat with Lewis in a narrow cellar below the college, where the air was thick with the smell of cork and damp oak, and where the keeper's name returned again, spoken in lowered voices, accompanied by a glance over the shoulder. The cellar-master, a man who measured time in vintages rather than years, uncorked a dusty bottle with the reverence of a priest at the altar. He told us the scholar, before his death, had lately been drinking more than was his custom. A curious excess, for he was not known for indulgence. And, when pressed, the cellar-master added that he had not been drinking alone. There had been a woman with him once or twice who asked for port, with the kind of assurance that suggested old familiarity rather than passing acquaintance. She had signed nothing in the visitor's book. Lewis frowned, suspicious of gossip. But it struck me that wine is never simply about drinking. It is about company, about the unguarded slips of speech that flow between glasses. If the woman was the same figure we had glimpsed in the gallery, then her presence with him meant more than scholarly interest. The scholar had been solitary. Such a company does not arrive without reason. And reason, in Oxford, is often as dangerous as passion. Later, in the bursar's office, we came upon the matter of wills. The scholar had left no fortune, but the small funds he possessed were the subject of quiet speculation. A letter of intent had been drawn up, though not signed. The keeper had been named as executor, a detail both ordinary and troubling. For who better to control the fate of a man's work than the one who had most to gain from its disappearance? Lewis muttered that execution was a practical matter, nothing more. I said that practicality is often the disguise of ambition. I leafed through the unsigned document, noting the neat typeface, the spaces left for witness signatures that never came, and at the margin a faint, penciled note of 3 words not yet ready. Whose hand had written it? The scholar, anxious to defer his own mortality, or another's, eager to postpone the finality of law? The handwriting was small, tentative, and yet it leaned forward, as though impatient. I closed the file with a sense of unfinished confession. We returned to the quadrangle, the stones glistening with rain, and I thought again of the woman's words in the gallery exile left a mark. Wine, women, and wills are three strands that, when knotted together, can tighten into a rope. Each strand on its own is innocent enough, together they can strangle. I told Lewis that the absence of signatures disturbed me more than their presence might have. He asked why. Because an unsigned will is a promise suspended, I replied, and promises are often worth more than the deeds themselves. That night, I poured myself a glass of red, letting it breathe while I studied the crossword once more. There was another clue I had overlooked: 6 letters, definition inheritance. I filled in the legacy almost without thought. But legacy is more than property. It is what others take from us, whether or not we give it. Perhaps the scholar's true legacy was not the fragments he catalogued, but the silence he left behind, the torn page, the unfinished word. I drank slowly, aware of the hour, aware of the shadows lengthening across the city. Wine, women, and wills. The trinity of motives, perhaps, or perhaps nothing at all. Yet I could not help feeling that beneath the dust of antiquities and the silence of the galleries, Oxford had begun writing its own will, and that I, unwillingly, was named among its witnesses. There are few words as final as Elegy. One does not write them for the living. And yet Oxford, with its cloisters and chapels, seems to compose elegies in stone each day, lines of grief carved into archways, laments sung in the echo of bells. It was in the chapel of Magdalen late afternoon that I heard the second elegy, not in words, but in the tremor of an organ line drifting upward into silence, a service for someone unknown to most of those present, the kind of gathering that attracts the dutiful rather than the bereft. Still, it unsettled me. Lewis sat beside me on the hard pew, shifting awkwardly, his broad frame ill at ease among cassocks and incense. He whispered that he did not see the point of such rituals when no family had come. I replied that the absence of family is the very reason one needs ritual. He fell silent, his gaze resting on the stained glass, where saints and martyrs endured their fates with expressions too calm to be believed. I found no calm in them, only resignation. The chaplain's voice was steady, unremarkable, and in that very steadiness I found the trace of indifference. A man has died, a scholar of antiquities, his work unfinished, his words torn away. And Oxford responds with murmured prayers and a hymn that no one sings above a whisper. That is the way of the city. It prefers its grief muted, like the pale drizzle that dampens the high without ever quite becoming rain. Afterwards, in the vestry, I noticed a sheet of music left upon the lectern, an anthem in minor key, the title blurred by candle wax. But beneath the notes, in a hand far less musical, someone had scrawled a phrase remembering the woman. I stared at it until the letters blurred into the stave. Lewis asked what troubled me, and I told him nothing. He would not have seen the significance. To him it was vandalism. To me it was another fragment, like the torn page, the folded crossword, the unfinished game of chess, pieces of a pattern not yet visible. We walked out into the cloister, our footsteps loud against the wet stone. I thought of the woman in the gallery, her fingers against the glass, her voice speaking of exile. She had touched something more than clay. She had touched the scholar himself, perhaps in ways unrecorded, unacknowledged. And now someone within the chapel had written her into an elegy that was not hers. Or perhaps it was. Perhaps she had been mourning long before we noticed. Lewis asked if I believed she was involved. I said belief is too strong a word. Suspicion is quieter, more patient. He frowned, unused to answers that were not answers at all, but I could not give him more, not yet. All I knew was that her presence kept returning, as insistent as the tolling of the bell that had first unsettled me. Coincidences, I have said before, are rarely innocent. The wind rose through the cloister, carrying the faint smell of wet stone and candle smoke. I paused by the memorial tablets on the wall, names inscribed in precise capitals, men long gone yet still present in stone. An elegy carved, not spoken, and I thought of the scholar's notebook, its page torn clean, leaving behind an absence that spoke louder than any inscription. Was this his elegy, then? Not the hymn in the chapel, but the silence he left in the middle of his own work. That night I sat alone with the crossword once more. One clue I had overlooked returned to me, as though whispered in the chapel's hush. 5 letters lament. The answer, elegy, already penciled, faintly in but struck through. Someone had written it, then withdrawn it. A hesitation? Or a correction? Either way, it was the second elegy I had encountered that day, and it reminded me, with an unease I could not name, that not all elegies are for the dead. It is often in the smallest errors that the largest truths reside. A misquoted line of verse can betray more about the speaker than any careful confession. I discovered this one evening in the senior common room. The fire sunk low when the keeper recited a fragment of Eliot with the quiet assurance of a man rehearsing familiarity. He said the line ended not with silence, but with exile. Exile. I knew then that he had not merely read the poem, but bent it to his own purpose. Lewis looked at me afterwards, puzzled. He thought nothing of it. "People misquote all the time," he said. I told him that ordinary men misquote carelessly, but scholars misquote deliberately. He frowned, as he often did when I wandered too far into abstraction. Yet the word exile carried too much weight to be dismissed. It had appeared in the crossword, in the scholar's translation, in the woman's voice at the gallery. Now it surfaced in the keeper's mouth, like a shard of pottery washed up again and again on the same shore. The rain had followed us indoors, damp footprints marking the floorboards, the air heavy with the smell of wet wool. The dons spoke quietly in corners, their sentences half finished as if words might implicate them. I sat in a leather chair, glass in hand, and thought of how Oxford collects quotations the way the Ashmolean collects fragments, misfiled, misplaced, sometimes genuine, sometimes forged. And all the while, beneath the veneer of scholarship, there is the silence of what is not said. The misquotation led me back to the scholar's notebook. I returned to it in my room that night, the lamp angled harshly on the ink. Between the lines of transliteration I noticed a faint indentation, words once pressed but since erased. The pressure of a nib lingers longer than its ink. I tilted the page, caught the light, and read the ghost of a line. "This is the way the world ends," and beneath it the word exile penciled faintly, then rubbed out. The keeper's misquotation was no accident. He had read it here, or wrote it himself. Lewis, when I showed him, shook his head. "Could be anything," he said. "But I knew better. A scholar does not erase lightly. To erase is to conceal, and concealment is always an act of intent. Whether the scholars or the keepers, I could not yet tell. Still the ghost of that word whispered too insistently to ignore. The following day I encountered the woman again, briefly, in the Bodleian. She was seated beneath the dome, a book open but unread, her gaze fixed on nothing. I asked whether she knew Eliot. She smiled faintly and said she preferred Donne. Death be not proud, a different sort of exile. Her voice carried no irony, only the fatigue of someone too acquainted with absence. And again her hand brushed the page, not to turn it, but as though she might reach through it. A gesture so slight that Lewis, had he been there, would never have noticed. But I did. And it told me she, too, lived among unfinished sentences. That evening, alone once more, I worked at the crossword. 1 clue, 5 letters, banished in verse. The answer, I thought at once, was exiled, but when I penciled it in, the letters did not fit. Only void would do, a misfit, a distortion. Just as exile had replaced silence in the keeper's tongue. Just as the scholar's notebook bore words rubbed out, altered. Misquotation, misfit, misplacement. They are cousins of deceit. I poured a final whiskey, the liquid catching the light like amber sorrow, and sat with the crossword unfinished before me. Outside, Oxford slept under its veil of rain. Inside, the silence pressed closer, filled with echoes of bells, of words erased, of lines recited incorrectly, yet with purpose. A misquoted poet, a folded page, a fragment of clay, each demanding to be heard, each refusing to say precisely what it meant. And I, caught among them, left with only suspicion, which is sometimes the only truth a man may claim. The Ashmolean has its storerooms in places rarely visited by those who wander the public galleries. There the air is cooler, heavier, infused with the odour of wood shavings and varnish, the faint musk of things too long enclosed. It was in such a room, beneath the dim hum of a single strip light, that Lewis and I found ourselves one late afternoon. A custodian with a nervous cough had produced a key after some hesitation, as though reluctant to disturb what had been shut away. Inside, shelves bowed beneath boxes labelled in neat, fading script. Pottery, textiles, manuscripts, each sealed against time. The floorboards creaked with the weight of centuries, and our footsteps echoed unnaturally as though the dead themselves were listening. It was not the grandeur of antiquity that struck me, but the banality of its storage. Civilizations reduced to cardboard and string. The custodian gestured towards a table where certain items from the scholar's work had been set aside. Among them lay the fragment he had last attempted to translate, the one marked with that insistent word, exile. The clay was cracked, its inscription half effaced, yet even in silence it commanded attention. Lewis bent closer, but it was not the object that held me, it was the ledger beside it, open at a page where the scholar had entered his notes. The handwriting was neat as ever, but on the facing sheet in another hand a line had been added in pencil return denied. The phrase startled me with its bluntness. Was it translation, commentary, or warning? I asked the custodian who else had access. He stammered that the keeper alone held the master key. Lewis muttered something about oversight, though his voice lacked conviction. I thought instead of the chessboard abandoned mid-game, of the misquoted poet, of the folded crossword. All fragments of a dialogue carried out in silence, and here yet another phrase written without signature. As we moved deeper into the storeroom, I noticed a box on the lower shelf, its lid askew. Within lay personal effects, notebooks, letters, photographs. Some were clearly the scholar's, consigned here after his death. A careless hand had placed them without order. I sifted gently through the papers until one detail caught me, an envelope, addressed in a woman's hand, the writing firm, Decisive. The seal was broken, but the letter itself was missing. Only the envelope remained, as though the words had been deliberately extracted, leaving behind only the frame. Another page torn, another silence imposed. Lewis asked what I had found. I told him nothing of consequence. He would have pressed for the obvious, for names, dates, tangible facts, but all I had were absences, and absences do not convince the practical mind. Still, I tucked the envelope back with more care than had been shown before. Before we left, I returned to the ledger. The phrase "return denied" had been written at an angle, the pressure heavier on the final word, as though the writer had lingered, reluctant to lift the pencil. I recalled the woman's hand against the glass, the softness of her touch, So unlike this emphatic script. Not hers then, perhaps his, or the keeper's. I could not say. What I knew was that the storeroom, with all its quiet order, had yielded only further disorder. Not answers, but complications. We stepped back into the corridor, the custodian locking the door with evident relief. The light seemed too bright after the gloom, the air too quick upon the lungs. Lewis remarked that we were no closer than before. I agreed, though I felt the opposite. We were closer not to a solution, but to its absence, to the hollow at the heart of the matter where words had been erased, torn, or left unsaid. That evening, I sat with the crossword again. A clue I had not solved caught my eye, 6 letters kept in reserve. The answer was stored. I wrote it in with a reluctant hand and thought of the storeroom objects, letters, fragments, all kept in reserve, all withheld. And yet what is stored too long is never truly safe. It begins, slowly, to speak in its silence. There is a certain stillness that comes at the end of any investigation, though it is rarely peace. More often it is the hush that follows the tolling of a bell, when one realizes the echo will not quite fade, but remain faint and insistent in the air. That evening, with the rain pressing against my window and the city steeped in its own shadows, I began to write my own conclusion to the elegy that had haunted us from the first page, torn to the last misquoted line. Lewis had left earlier, his footsteps heavy on the stair, his coat damp with the weather. He had spoken of practicalities, reports, statements, the language of bureaucracy that files grief under reference numbers. I envied him for his certainties, though they were often illusory. I remained with the fragments spread before me, the crossword, the half-played game of chess, the scholar's notebook with its absence like an open wound. They formed no pattern I could wholly trust. And yet, together they whispered that absence itself was the pattern, that what had been erased mattered more than what was written. I poured a measure of whiskey, amber and melancholy, and allowed myself to think again of the woman. I had seen her twice more in passing, never long enough to ask what I wanted, always long enough to know she carried her own silence with her. She was neither witness nor culprit, but something more elusive. An elegy walking in human form, a reminder that exile is not always geographical. Some exiles are lived out within a single room, or within the boundaries of a memory one cannot discard. The keeper, too, lingered in my thoughts. His misquotation of Eliot had seemed small at the time, but now it glowed like an ember in the dark. Exile where there should have been silence, a substitution, deliberate or unconscious, that betrayed more than he knew. I recalled the way his eyes had strayed to the folded page on his desk, the way his hand had hovered near it yet never touched. A man does not fear paper unless it holds a truth too fragile to survive the light. In the crossword I had left unfinished, one final clue remained, 7 letters, final song. The obvious answer was elegiac, but the letters would not fit no matter how I tried. Only silence would do. I penciled it in, the letters stark and uncompromising, and found in that small deduction the shape of the entire affair. The scholar's notes, the woman's gestures, the keeper's evasions all pointed not to revelation, but to silence itself. An elegy concluded not with clarity, but with an absence one must learn to live alongside. Lewis had once asked me, half in jest, whether I ever longed for cases with simple endings. I told him no. Simplicity is a lie, I said, though perhaps I wished I could believe otherwise. He looked at me then as though I were the puzzle, and perhaps I was. That is the trouble with elegies. They are written not only for the dead, but for those left behind to read them. Outside, the rain eased, leaving the city glistening as though freshly inscribed. The bells of Magdalen struck the hour, their sound carrying across the wet stones, the river, the cloisters. I listened until the last reverberation faded, leaving me with nothing but the faint scratching of my own pen. And I thought then that perhaps all we ever do in the end is misquote poets, fold away unfinished puzzles, and hope that someone, somewhere, will understand the silence we leave behind. I closed the notebook, drained the glass, and let the night settle around me. The elegy was concluded, though the melody lingered unresolved.